We've been looking at Genesis, and we have talked about all kinds of stuff in Genesis. Right now we're in the middle of a story, and we're in the middle of it. We're not going to finish it today. Probably one of the best stories, single stories in the Old Testament. It's when you think about these ancient people, with particularly the limitations on writing, what they had to write. These long stories are amazing that they did, and so well structured. We're talking about people that certainly knew what they were doing, which is one of the things sometimes we forget, that ancient people just lack our knowledge, but
they may not.
They aren't stupid, and they just don't know what we know, because knowledge accumulates, and people, 150 years from now will look at us and say, man, they were stupid. But it's just because knowledge accumulates, and that's what happens.
Look at these kids walking down the street with their cell phone and changing phones to different people.
Oh, absolutely.
And one's driving. That aggravates me.
Yeah, when they're doing it.
But there they go.
Yeah, and when you're driving and they're walking in front of the car and they're looking down. But so anyway, we've got these wonderful stories. And what are some of the stories we've looked at to this point in Genesis? Because we're in the 39th chapter, so we're coming down to a conclusion.
Creation.
Only got a couple. We got the creation story, and as we think about what's going on with the creation story.
It's God's story.
Yeah, the whole thing is God's story, and as and again, I'm going to call him redactor, because that's what you call him. He's putting together stories. He's really not, and I'm saying he as though it's one person, but it may not be. He's taking these stories that have been written, and he's reshaping them, and sometimes reordering them, so that it conveys how he sees God and God working with humanity. And he's writing it for a later generation, and he's taking stories that are being developed and written down in different places. And evidently he sees that as important enough that he doesn't go into a lot of those stories and rewrite it, because he could. He's not stupid. He could have rewritten those stories so that it's a nice, clean narrative, but he chose not to. Instead, he's taking these stories and putting them together and combining them so that there's a flow, but there's a distinctiveness in each of the individual stories. What's kind of interesting is when you think about him doing that, that's not all that radically different than what the evangelists are doing in their Gospels. I'm teaching Luke on Thursday evenings. And as we look at Luke, we're seeing Luke is doing the same thing with those stories. And sometimes, like we saw last week with Luke, he will change in order, and we know he's changing in order because he's moving something that hasn't happened, or reference to something that hasn't happened yet, up high. People ask in Jesus' hometown, why won't you do what you did in Capernaum here? And then we don't have Capernaum mentioned until the next story. So the writer is moving stories around, but he's doing it to convey how he perceives the gospel and how he wants us to see the good news of Jesus Christ. And that's what the redactor of Genesis is doing. He's taking these stories to convey a biography, a story about God and how God is working with humanity, and particularly with the fathers. Oh, and one other thing, during the summer, we're going to spend the summer in church worship talking about the fathers. So during the summer worship, I'm going to be preaching on the patriarchs. So we'll be in Genesis during the worship service. So that's something you will know already. And when you hear it, what you want to do is you want to look at other people in church as they're listening, and you want to look at them and kind of shake your head, because you already know it. You already know what I'm saying. So, when they say, oh, you look at it and say, well, if you came on Wednesday, you'd know. That's always good. That makes them feel good. Yeah,
I'm sure.
yeah. Okay, so we got creation. What's some of the other stories?
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve. We've got
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel. Noah and
The flood.
the flood, a bunch of things. Okay. Now it's interesting, and then Tower of Babel, what you've mentioned first are stories that kind of predate the patriarchs, right? Almost prehistory stories. That are written in almost like a saga kind of style. A big things happening, and we've got a pattern in those that humanity. God says something, humanity decides not to do it. Humanity pays the consequences, and God shows mercy and grace at the end. Until we got very good. That's good. Need to get that tattooed somewhere. Because that's a good one. Until we get to the end of the Babel story, and that mercy and compassion, that sign of grace would appear to be the beginning of the patriarchs, the beginning of the story of ultimately the story of Israel, of God's people. And who will when I've used this term a couple of times, patriarchs. Who are the patriarchs? Who are they?
Abraham.
Abraham's a patriarch. In fact, he was the first. He was the father Abraham. He was the first one.
The covenant.
Right? Yeah, and the covenant, that's great. The covenant was made with Abraham. And again, we're talking about a redactor working with these stories that he believes are important. We've got a couple of different covenants made with Abraham, depending on where the stories come from. But the redactor thinks the terms God, or the promise, it's not promise. What God is going to do as his part of the covenant is consistent. What is God going to do for Abraham and his descendants?
Bless and land.
He's going to give them land, and he's going to give them, what else is he going to give them? Children. He's going to give them descendants. He's going to give them land, and he's going to give them descendants. So those are consistent in terms of what he's going to provide. What is he looking for from humanity's side, from Abraham's side?
Obedience.
Okay, in one covenant, it's obedience and circumcision. That's the ultimate sign that you're going to obey me, is that you're going to get circumcised. It's a sign of obedience. What's the other one in the other covenant? And evidently the redactor thinks both of them are important enough to keep distinct. Trust, that's it. He's looking for trust. And that's the first covenant he makes with Abraham. When we're looking, or Abram, when we're looking at chapter 12, the very beginning, he says, I want you to trust me, because I'm going to send you to a place you don't even know. And I want you to trust me to follow you. Follow my instructions. And that's coming first. And then later we've got the covenant where I want you to obey me. And you obey me by getting circumcised. Okay, and both of those are tested. Both the trust is tested, and later the obedience is tested. And the obedience is tested with Isaac. That you just got to obey. This is what I'm telling you to do. You got to do it. And you don't like it, and it's going to cause all kinds of problems related to the covenant, but my goodness gracious, I want you to do it. And by gum, Abraham sure looks like he's going to do it, until God intervenes. So we've got that as an example. Now that's one that's the first patriarch. Who he's followed by not his oldest son, but by his younger son. Not Jacob yet. Who comes between Jacob and Isaac? Isaac and Ishmael is the oldest, but the promise goes to Isaac. And the promise from Isaac goes to Jacob. And Jacob's situation is a little nuts, because what's Jacob's situation?
You got 12 of them.
Well, Jacob is going to have 12 sons. But what is Jacob's birth situation? That's a little interesting. He's Remember, he's one of two. You know, he's twins. You know, Jacob is twins, and his older brother is Esau, right? And yet Rebekah, his mother, knows before either one was born that Jacob would carry the promise. That the younger would be the one to carry the promise, the older will serve the younger. And that's really important. Again, pointing at God. This is God's story. This is God making these decisions, not human beings. And Paul makes a big deal of this in Romans. You know, that God chose to love Jacob and hate Esau. And that's what Malachi says too. Why did God do that? Don't know. You know, that's what God does. You know, because Paul even goes and says, before they had done anything at all, God chose to love one and hate the other. Now, hyperbole. He didn't hate, because it ends up, because he chooses Jacob, the descendants of Esau are going to be saved, because Jacob is going to lead to Jesus Christ. So for God here, it's not based on the quality of character, because if it was based on quality of character, would Jacob be chosen?
No
Absolutely not, because Jacob is no good. You know, Jacob is no good. And it's not like he proves it once. He proves it
many times,
over and over and over again. You know, he is not a good guy, Jacob is. I mean, what's some of the things that Jacob does that shows he isn't much? You don't want your daughter dating Jacob. You know, Lord, I don't want Maggie to find a Jacob. Jeez Louise. He may already have a Leah. Anyway. So, what are some of the things Jacob does that shows that this is not, God isn't looking at his new character and choosing the better boy, you know.
Did he lie about his wife too?
Well, yeah. That's a good guess. You know, lie like his granddaddy did, like his twice, and his daddy did once. Oh. No, he didn't. That was one thing Jacob didn't do.
Okay.
He may have put his wife and kids in front of him.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
When Esau was coming. You know, he may have done that, but he didn't.
When he went to see Esau, he put his servants and his animals and
yeah, he didn't lie about them. So yeah, he sort of avoided that one. But he did other things. What did he do that shows his character?
Stole from his father-in-law.
Stole from his father-in-law. You know, now Laban, his father-in-law,
was no good either.
was also a piece of work. You know, because Laban was looking to cheat him. You know, and even in that deal, Laban was trying to stack the deck.
He gave him I'm your daughter first.
Yeah, and gave, and who has that not happened to? You know, who among us hasn't seen that situation working itself out? You know, I don't know, maybe Debbie married me to get at my brother. You know, maybe she got stuck with me when she really wanted to marry Gary. I don't know, which wouldn't have been a bad idea, to tell you the truth. But so he cheats. Well, what else does he do? What does he do to his brother, for crying out loud?
We took his blessing and stuff.
Takes the blessing and lies
Over
to
and
his
over again.
lies to his daddy about the blessing and impersonates his brother with his mom encouraging him.
Rachel.
Yeah, and then but before that he steals his brother's birthright.
Oh, because of the food.
Over a bowl of lentil stew, which is depressing. You know, so he steals that.
His brother was hungry.
Yeah, I mean, this Jacob.
Everything up.
Jacob is a mess. He is a piece of work, and yet it is Jacob that will carry
the blessing.
The blessing will carry the promise. And you said Jacob ends up having 12 sons, 12 kids, and more than 12 kids, 12 sons. And to get those 12 sons, he has two wives, and two wives with quotation marks. Wife lights, kind of. And he has these 12, but he really loves one wife more than the others, the other wife and the other maids. And who does he love the most? Oh, he loves Rachel. Rachel, he loves Rachel. And who is the son of Rachel? Who is the son? Rachel, the son of Jacob / Israel, because remember his name was changed. Joseph is the son. Now, we got Benjamin hanging around there because we got this little story about bearing Benjamin and then dying, and then later she's still alive. And so it's a little confusing because, again, he's taking these stories and he believes they have integrity in and of themselves, which is kind of what I'm encouraging you to do. Is to view the stories as having integrity, so we don't want to monkey with them. And evidently the redactor feels the same way. And so even though, later she shows up again, she dies in childbirth bearing Benjamin. So Benjamin is there because Benjamin's going to play a role in the story later. But Joseph is his daddy's pride and joy, right? And what does Jacob or Israel do for Joseph? Gives him a coat. Gives him a coat. And of many colors or long sleeves, depending on how you translate the Hebrew, because it's not crystal clear, so it can kind of go in different directions. But he has this special coat, right? And his brothers love him for it, right? They hate him for it because they're jealous of this coat. And of course, Joseph knows that. And so what does Joseph do? First he tattles on them, and then he shares with them his dreams, and his dreams involve what?
Him being better.
Him being better than his brothers, which is kind of interesting when you've got 11 brothers that are or 10 brothers that are jealous of you anyway, right? And you're telling them, look at my beautiful coat. I told Daddy on you when you were bad. And let me tell you about my dreams. Yeah. And his brothers really, really don't like him. And what do they do to him?
They want to kill him.
They want to kill him. And how are they going to kill him?
Throwing him in
They're going to, because Reuben intervenes, the oldest, and says, you don't kill him, throw him in a pit. And so they throw him in a pit. Reuben is going to go someplace, maybe for a sandwich. And what ends up happening to little Joseph in the pit?
They pull him back out and sell him.
Well, yeah, Judah says, we don't want to kill him, leave him here and die. And evidently there's a bunch of Ishmaelites passing by. Why don't we sell him? And he ends up being sold to Ishmaelites who are heading to Egypt, and we know they sell him to Potiphar. Well, Potiphar's an officer at Pharaoh's court. And this is going to be one of those interesting things as we see with Joseph in the stories today. So we got Joseph in Egypt, we got his brothers, and they take the coat and they dip it into goat blood and they show it to Dad and say, Dad, Joseph had an accident. He was attacked and eaten by a goat. No, by a wild goat, by a wild animal, right? And here's his coat for proof. And Israel feels so sad that his favorite son is gone, and the boys have a party, right? Because the troublemaker is he's somewhere in Egypt, but the assumption is,
he becomes
a big deal.
Big deal
In Egypt. Do the brothers have any expectations of him being a big deal in Egypt?
No.
He is just going to be another slave in Egypt. Done. Okay. So, but we the reader know that doesn't tend to be the way God acts, right? Because what has God done repeatedly? What does God do repeatedly?
Shows mercy?
What's that?
Shows mercy?
Well, he does show mercy. He overcomes problems, right? Because you throw a dart at the women, you're going to hit a barren one. You know, the wives of the patriarchs, they're all barren. And yet God always overcomes that. And that's a big deal in the ancient world. You know, so even as we approach this Joseph story, we don't approach it saying, well, Joseph is gone. Must be another one of the sons. Now, we're also kind of set up based on the way the other stories have run. Who's going to be the one to carry the promise? Based on how the stories we have encountered, the Abraham stories, the Isaac stories, what son of Jacob, Israel, would we assume is going to carry the promise?
Joseph.
We would assume Joseph is, because that's the way it's worked. The younger has always been the one carrying the promise, the one of the favored, Sarah and Rebekah, they are the ones that carry. So and the focus tends to be on the favored one, or the one who carries. So we're kind of set up for Joseph to be the one to carry the promise. Now, later for Christians, that's not going to be the case, because who will Christians later say are the ones? Who's going to be the one to carry the promise?
Jesus.
Well, Jesus is, and you don't trace Jesus back to Jacob through Joseph. If you look at the genealogy, Joseph doesn't show up in any of the genealogies of Jesus. Well, only two. But in neither genealogy does Joseph show up. Who shows up in that which son of Jacob, Israel, ends up being the one that becomes the ancestor of Jesus? Judah does. And remember, we had that little story last week we talked about Judah and Tamar, and that was a seedy little story. That becomes the one the Christians see carrying the promise. Clearly, in what we have seen Genesis so far, it would be Joseph. And that's going to be one of the interesting, and I've mentioned it, and then we're going to get into the story itself. One of the interesting things we see when we look at the traditions, because we have a northern tradition and a southern tradition. And the southern tradition later, when people are reading this the first time, we've already got a divided kingdom. We've got two kingdoms. We've got two states. One of them is Israel, and the other one is Judah. Israel and Judah are separate kingdoms. After Solomon, the kingdoms, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the kingdoms separate. And you got tribes that go with the north, and tribe one, actually it ends up being 3 tribes that are kind of consolidated in the south. But Judah is at the center. And so you've got these 2 states. And Judah is going to be the one that's going to be, because it's going to have Israel, it's going to have Jerusalem and the temple. It's going to be the one that's the big deal. And that's going to be Judah is going to be the descendant. But you've got this northern tradition where Joseph becomes sort of the key. And particularly one of his sons that's introduced in what we'll look at today, his younger son named Ephraim. Ephraim's going to be the key to that northern tradition. That's going to be the favored tribe up north, just like Judah is the favored tribe in the south. Okay, so anyway, that we're going to see. Now, we've got Joseph where? As we enter 39, where is Joseph?
Egypt.
Okay, he's in Egypt. Who's he with?
Potiphar.
Okay, he's with Potiphar, and Potiphar is big deal, captain of the guard. Okay. Now, and the writer tells us what? Right at the beginning of the story. And he's going to remind us of this periodically in the story.
That he was bought.
Well, he was bought, right? So his situation on the surface is bad. Bad. Because slaves, they have tough life. In any ancient society, in any society, slaves have a tough life. So it is a bad deal for Joseph, but the writer tells us something right at the beginning.
Joseph.
What's that?
The Lord was with
The Lord
Joseph,
was with
and he was going
Joseph.
to make him prosperous.
Boom. We know right at the beginning. Now, I think this is really important as we approach it. Because the writer of the story, and it seems to be one hand writing this whole story, because there's a flow to the story. It's not jumping around. But the writer doesn't want us to be surprised. Because he tells us right up front that the Lord is with Joseph. So it's like I've said before, it's like watching Columbo on television, where you know who murdered. In Columbo, it wasn't a mystery. You know who did the murdering. And the whole show is, how does Columbo solve it? But you already know who's guilty, because you saw it at the beginning of the episode. That's what we've got here. The writer tells us that the Lord is with Joseph. Therefore, we know at the end of the story what?
It's the Lord that did it.
It's going to be the Lord that did it, and Joseph's going to be successful at the end. And it's going to be the Lord's doing, and therefore, he doesn't want us to be so, wow, how did that happen? No, we know how it happened. How did it happen? The Lord is with Joseph. And so we see that throughout the story. And so we want to file it, we want to make sure we file that away, because the writer wouldn't tell us up front if he didn't want us to know. And Joseph's going to face some rough times, but the Lord is with him. So the Lord is with him, and what happens as he's with Potiphar?
Well, he's good looking.
Well, okay, before the writer tells us he's good looking, and thank you for commenting on that first.
Shelley's not here, somebody has to do it.
Yeah. I'm reminded of my brother all the stupid time. Not that it bothers me, not that it bothers me. So anyway, we've got right even before he's called good looking. What do we know about Joseph?
He's successful.
He's really, really successful. Not only is he successful,
Says all, Egypt.
so is Potiphar. Potiphar's successful, right?
Right.
And Joseph finds favor with Potiphar, and Potiphar does what to Joseph?
Let's take care of everything.
Takes care of everything. And the writer, I want you to notice, because this writer is shaping the story. Potiphar not only promotes Joseph in his household. What does the writer say about Joseph?
He doesn't have to worry about anything.
Potiphar doesn't do anything. Because Joseph
Does it all.
does it all. And all Potiphar has to worry about is
Eating.
what he's going to have for lunch. That is the only thing that's on Potiphar's mind. Because why is that the case? Why is that the case?
Because the Lord's blessed.
Yes, the Lord is with Joseph. It's not because of Joseph's skill. The Lord is with Joseph. That's what the writer wants us to know. Now, say it again.
He's good looking.
He's good looking. And because he's good looking, because he's so good looking.
And her husband only wants to eat.
Yeah. Which, when you look at this, that's pretty accurate. This is really pretty accurate. He's worried about, but Potiphar's wife.
She notices. Hard not to.
Yeah, hubba hubba.
She wanted something.
Yeah. And it wasn't a hamburger.
She didn't want to be his cook and bottle washer.
Yeah. So she casts her eyes on Joseph. And how does Joseph, and she makes a proposition to Joseph. And how does Joseph respond?
No, that wasn't.
He says, absolutely not. And there are two good reasons for that.
It's immoral, it's sinning against God.
Yeah, one, Potiphar, put me in charge of everything but you. He didn't put me in charge of you. And
that wasn't the job to require.
that's right. This is wicked and sinful in the sight of God. And so Joseph is aware of what? If he says, Potiphar did not put me in charge of you, and I could lose my job, But even more than that, this is wicked in the sight and sinful in the sight of God.
Right.
Joseph is aware of what?
That God has.
That God is with him. Yeah. And so as we're reading the story, not only do we know God is with him, but it would appear that Joseph knows God is with him. Okay? But what does Potiphar's wife do?
Grabs his clothes.
Well, she keeps on, right? She won't let it drop. Keeps on, keeps on, keeps on. And eventually, and I love just thinking, this is really well written. You know, nobody else is home. You know, everybody else is home. Just Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And Joseph is, you know, straightening up the stuff, doing what slaves do. And Potiphar's wife says,
Come to bed with me.
"Hey, big boy." And Joseph says, "No." And what? I'm going to leave. And what does Potiphar's wife do? Grabs his clothes and holds them as Joseph does what?
Runs away.
Starts streaking down the hall as she's holding his clothes. Now, what does she choose to do? Holding the clothes, she screams. And when she screams, what happens?
The servants come.
Okay, other servants kind of come and she says what?
Tried to rape me.
Yes, that's what this guy is doing. This guy is pushing himself on me and he was about to assault me and I fought him off, right? And I can prove it because, you know, I'm holding his underwear right here. You know, I've got him in my hands. And the servants say, "Oh, that's pretty awful." But she doesn't just tell them, she tells her husband. Now, have we seen this sort of thing happen to Joseph before? Yeah. When did this situation, context different, but the same sort of thing happen? What sort of thing happened before? Well, he had this beautiful, coat that he was given and caused his brothers to be jealous and motivated them to kill him, to throw him in a pit and sell him to a bunch of Ishmaelites. And if you've ever been sold to Ishmaelites, it is not pleasant. It is not pleasant to be with Ishmael. It's not even good to be with them because they're, don't want to get me started on Ishmaelites.
They're barbarians.
They're barbarians. They're terrible. You know what they are? They're no good. They're no good. Okay, so she tells Potiphar. Potiphar reacts by
Throw him in prison.
saying, "Oh, you poor thing, darling, I'm sorry. That's awful. He's a terrible guy." And so you're laughing. Barb, why are you laughing?
She's a terrible woman.
she's a scarlet woman, you know, with heavily massacred eyes. You know, she's a terrible. I'm sorry, because you sell cosmetics.
Yes.
I'm sorry, but I'm sure she had a lot of blush. A lot of blush on. And so Potiphar does what to him?
Throws him in prison.
You know, takes him and throws him into prison where the other kings, where Pharaoh's prisoners are kept. And so we, the reader, may say, "Well, that's it for Joseph," right? But the writer, because he's good at what he does, he immediately tells us what?
The Lord.
The Lord is with Joseph,
And bless him.
even in jail. He's with Joseph. And what does the Lord do?
Joseph becomes charged of all the other prisoners.
Okay, Joseph becomes a trustee. And sort of the head trustee. He becomes in charge of the other prisoners, in fact, to the point that the warden, what's his position?
He didn't pay attention.
Yeah, he didn't even have to pay attention. Because Joseph is now
Handling everything.
handling everything. Now, I think that's really just as sort of an aside. But who's responsible for this?
The blessing.
God is. You know, we got to constantly go back to this. You know, it is the Lord that's doing it, not Joseph's innate skill or education. The Lord is doing this for Joseph, right? And the writer is reminding us of that. I think it's worth noting that the Lord is with him as Joseph is doing stuff. You know, it's not Joseph sitting in the cell and all of a sudden having food appear. You know, Joseph is acting, and the Lord is with him as he takes action. You know, as he's doing what he's told to do, the Lord is with him. And I think that's worth noting. Again, as an aside, I don't think that's a major thread because we don't see it as a dominant theme in Genesis. But a lot of times we Christians have the idea that, you know, if you pray, you know, you find groceries on your back porch, which is fine. I'm not negating that. That's not what we see here. You know,
It's an action word.
yeah, it's an action. Yeah, he's taking action, and God is with him as he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. And I think that's worth noting, that maybe God blesses us when we do something and not just sit and wait for God to do something, you know. So anyway, just as an aside.
Looks for good works.
Well, he's looking for us to do something. You know, he seems to be blessing what Joseph does. And if Joseph doesn't do anything, there's nothing to bless.
I think he looks for us to trust him, to walk in faith and trust in him, and he intervenes and with his mercy and grace. But
Right.
we have to do, like you said, we just can't sit there and say, he's not Santa Claus.
Well, you know, it's the old joke of the dam that's breaking.
Yeah.
You know, and the flood's coming into town, and they tell everybody to evacuate. And guy in a Jeep drives through the town making sure everybody's gone, and there's an old man sitting on his porch, you know, saying, have you heard this? Sitting on his porch, and the man said, man, we're evacuating, the dam's breaking, we're going to be flooded. Get into the Jeep, I'll take you to safety. And the old man says, no. I am a Christian and I trust in God. God will take care of me. And the water comes and gets higher and higher, and the man's now sitting on his roof, and a guy in a boat comes by and says, man, water's still coming, still rising. Get into the boat and I'll take you to safety. And he says, no, I am a Christian. I believe in God. God will take care of me. And a little bit later, he's holding on to his chimney. The water is right here. And a guy in a helicopter comes, drops a ladder, and says, grab hold of the ladder. I'll take you to safety. And the man says, nope, I'm a Christian. Looks bad. But I trust God. God's going to take care of me. Well, the water continues to rise, and the old man drowns. And he's before God, and he says, God, you really disappointed me, because I trusted you the whole stupid time, and you let me down. And God says, I sent a Jeep, a boat, and a helicopter.
Right.
You know, and I think that's, like I said, I don't think if I were to preach a sermon and say, this is the point of this, I don't think that's the point of this. I don't think that's the point here. But I do think that's sort of behind the scenes, that Joseph is acting. You know, is doing things. The main point of this is God is in control. God is in control of the story. And circumstances are not going to change the fact that God is in control. Okay, so we've got 39. What happens at the beginning of chapter 40? Now we got a unified story here. Joseph's in jail, right? What happens at the beginning of 40? New characters introduced.
Interpreting.
Okay, we got dreams. Now we've already been set up for dreams, right? Because earlier, he really ticked off his brothers by dreams that he self-interpreted, and they didn't like it. So we got this dream idea and two new characters. Who's introduced?
This wine steward and a baker.
We got a wine steward and we got a baker in jail. And of course, they both did what? Why are they in jail?
They upset the...
They ticked off Pharaoh. They ticked off the king. And so they're in jail. And Joseph, because he is the trustee of the prison, is doing what? Taking care of them, right? That's his job. And one night, what happens to both of them?
Both have a drink.
Same night. They both have dreams, right? And when they are troubled in the morning, right? And he asks, why you're upset, and what do they tell him?
They tell them the dream.
Yeah. No one can interpret, we've got this dream, but nobody can interpret. And what does Joseph say? Interpretation belongs to God. So again, writer makes sure that it's not going to be Joseph's ability. He is not really sharp. God is the one who's driving this story. And geez, the writer can't be clearer and making sure we know that, because he keeps on saying it over and over and over again. Okay, so God is with him, and God is the one who interprets dreams. Now, as the reader, all of a sudden we're thinking, ooh, Joseph interpreted his own dreams a little earlier. So maybe God was involved in that. Don't know, because it didn't say it explicitly, but when Joseph was doing it. But, if God is the interpreter of dreams, maybe what Joseph dreamed was, and his interpretation is based on God. So maybe it now has more credibility than it did before. What does the wine steward say? What's his dream?
In 3 days, three branches.
Okay, you got 3 branches, you got a bunch of grapes, squeezed them in a cup, did what?
Gave to the king.
Gave it to the king. That was my dream. What does it mean, Joseph? And Joseph says what?
He'll be rehired in 3 days.
Okay, the 3 branches, you got 3 days, and you are going to be restored. You're going to do what you have always done for the king. You're going to be giving him his wine in his cup. You are still going to bear his cup. And I imagine the wine steward said, hot dog, hot dog. And what does Joseph say? Which is kind of, again, before he goes on to dream number 2, he says to the wine steward, because you're going to be restored in 3 days.
I didn't do anything.
Yeah, tell Pharaoh I'm here. And he doesn't say, tell Pharaoh I'm a good interpreter of dreams. He says, tell Pharaoh what?
I don't deserve to be here.
Get me out of prison, because
I don't deserve it.
I don't deserve it. I am a captive. I am a Hebrew. I am a captive. And I didn't do what I was accused of doing. Now, it's very interesting that he calls himself a Hebrew, because the word Hebrew isn't an ethnic designation. Hebrew refers to a social status. And this is a term that's going to be really important in Exodus, that it's the Hebrews that are going to be led. Hebrews tended to be, economically they were slaves. It had an ethnic component, certainly, because the slaves were an enslaved people. But it had primarily to do with their status. And so it's very interesting. Now here he's using it, that I'm a foreigner, I'm a Hebrew. But this is the first time Hebrew's been used in that way in Genesis. It's going to be used in that way all over the place in Exodus. So we're kind of getting introduced to some Exodus stories. Okay, so this is what I am. Tell Pharaoh that I don't belong here, right? When you're restored. But of course nobody knows. We know he's going to be restored because we know what?
He's blessed.
He's blessed. God is with him. Okay, Baker steps up because he heard a pretty good interpretation the first time. Let me tell him my dream. And what's the dream?
About the bread.
Yeah, bread. I got 3 baskets on my head, and
The birds are eating.
birds are eaten out of the top basket. Tell me your interpretation, Joseph. When will I be restored? When will my head be lifted up?
Soon, in 3 days.
Yes, and Joseph says, well, funny you mention that. In 3 days, your head will be lifted up.
Yep.
On a pole. Because in 3 days, the king is going to do what? Is going to hang you from a pole. And you see well, what about the birds? Birds are really nice. Birds are, they're so cute. Flying around, making music.
Peck at him.
Yeah, they're going to peck at your dying body. Yeah, they're going to be biting at your flesh. Have a nice day. So, what ends up happening?
It happens.
Boom, it happens. Are we surprised?
No.
Well, duh. God is with Joseph. So of course this is going to happen. You know, that it's just what we didn't know, or what Joseph doesn't know is what? What happens? It becomes a little twist. Because the baker is hung, right? The wine steward is restored,
But he doesn't tell.
but he forgets. He forgets and doesn't tell the king to let Joseph out. Doesn't. Now, we read that. How do we, based on what we've read, how do we interpret that? Do we say, well, Joseph's done for now? Do we say that as the reader? Heck no, because we already know what?
He's blessed.
God, yeah, he's blessed. God is with him, right? So, and that's what the reader wants us to feel. This is, like I said, this is not, oh my goodness, what's going to happen next? This isn't like those old serials, the old movie serials, you know, when the guy is, the car is about to crash through the railing and go over the cliff. And, you know, you got to tune in next week to see what happens. You know, it's not like that, because we know, although watching those serials, you kind of had an idea Batman was going to intervene. You know, was going to do something. The guy wasn't going to crash in the bottom. But, you know, we know the story before it's even told. So we know it's going to work out. What happens at the beginning of chapter 41?
The king of Egypt has dreams.
Okay, now we've got the king of Egypt. Pharaoh's, he's having dreams. And what is his dream? It's a two-parter.
Cows.
First is cows. And what do we got with cows? We got 7 fat cows. Now, as soon as we see 7, perfect number. Ancient people love perfect numbers, you know, or prime number. You know, they love prime numbers. 7's a prime number. So 7 is often is a number often used because it's one that would attract the attention of somebody who likes numbers. So it's 7 cows, and they look
Fat.
oh, they are fat, and they are sleek. They are good-looking cows. They are good-looking cows. But they on a run. Who else is around?
7 thin cows.
You got 7 of the, and they not only are thin, they are the ugliest cows. And they are ugly. They are skinny and just plain ugly. And what's happening? What ends up happening?
They eat
The ugly ones eat the fat ones. Now, at this point, that's all we got, right? The ugly ones eat the fat ones. Okay, boom. Now we're part 2 of the dream. Pharaoh wakes up. Oh, that's awful. These cows in my dream. Oh, that's terrible. Goes back to sleep. Second dream. Yeah. 7. Now the cow one was better. The grains, he's kind of pushing it with this grain. We got on one stalk, it's got 7 heads of grain. And those heads of grain are,
Healthy and good.
oh, have mercy. They are great. I mean, they are big. The seeds are big. These are wonderful. And then you got,
Thin scorched.
oh, like it's been scorched by a hot wind. Boy, they look awful. All scraggly and ugly. And what ends up happening?
They eat that.
The ugly ones end up eating. Now, how grains eat, I don't know. But they consume, although, is there anybody who's a fan of 1950s horror movies? Or am I the only one?
Must be.
Yeah. Day of the Triffid. Day of the Triffid. Living plants that are eating things. Yeah, so, file that away. That's what, Alan?
La 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 la.
I'm just like her, I don't want to hear it.
Well, clearly nobody watched the Killer Shrews last Saturday night.
No.
Yeah, okay, I did. Dogs dressed up like, yeah, they had dogs. But that's neither here nor there. They were killer shrews and a puppet. Oh, the puppet was mean looking. Anyway, Pharaoh has these dreams. And what does Pharaoh do?
Tries to find out what's.
Tries to, yeah, duh, he's Pharaoh. Wants to, and who does he call in?
Magician
Oh.
and wise men.
Man, he's calling in everybody. All the smart people. And they don't know. They don't know, right? And all of a sudden, light bulb goes off over whose head?
Wine steward.
Ooh, the wine steward. And the wine steward says,
I have done.
it's really interesting. Because I remember a guy, how many years ago?
Probably
2 years ago. 2 years ago, I remember a guy who interpreted my dream. And remember that baker that you hung his dream? And the interpretation came true. And he may be able to help you. And so what does Pharaoh do? What does King do? Sends for Joseph, right? But you can't. He's been a slave in jail for a long time. He looks.
Undesirable.
Yeah, he looks he is no longer looking.
Fit.
Who's hot? Did you say hot, Ellen?
Well built, good looking. I didn't say that
I
I
think.
might be old. but
Yeah, that's right. You still know a hot Joseph when you see one.
I do.
Yeah, I think that's how the Living Bible translates it. Well, he's not looking so hot now, and I don't even think he's lukewarm. So what do?
Get them cleaned up and sent.
They get him cleaned up. They give him a shower, they give him a shave, they put on new clothes, and they present him to the king. And the king says what to him?
About his dreams. I had a dream.
Well, even before, I had this dream. No one can interpret it. They say you're really good at interpreting. And because the writer wants us to know that even Joseph knows
He's not.
he's not interpreted, Joseph says,
I cannot, your master, but God.
God. And favorable answer doesn't mean going to give him good news, but it's going to give him the truth. It's going to tell him the truth because he hasn't heard the. So it's not like God's guaranteed to bless you, Pharaoh. God's in control. Again, the writer wants us to know that. Okay, and what does Pharaoh do?
He tells him the dream.
Tells the dream, and he kind of elaborates on it a little bit because he says when the ugly cows eat the pretty cows, they look the same. They still look ugly. And when the grain eats the grains, they still look. Yeah, they're still wind-blown, wind-tossed, right? And Joseph gives an interpretation. Although, is it Joseph's interpretation? No, it is God's interpretation. And because he even says, as he's giving it, this was God revealing it to Pharaoh, right? And what is the interpretation?
You have 7 years of good and plenty.
Okay, you're going to have 7 years of a lot of grain. Okay,
Followed by 7 years of famine.
famine. Now, understand when we talk about Egypt, of course, we're talking about the civilization centered on the Nile River, and so the Nile, that Egypt was a breadbasket. I mean, that's one of the reasons why later people wanted to control Egypt. Egypt was prosperous because Egypt had something other places didn't have. Egypt had food, food, and because they could grow it, and because the Nile would flood, and the silt from the Nile would, so the ground was good, so that's Egypt was used to having. Was growing grain. It's hard to grow grain without irrigation in other places. So you're going to have 7 years of unusually good crops. And then what?
7 years of famine.
And then you're going to have 7 years of famine. But who's in control of this?
Go ahead.
God's in control of it. And what does Joseph recommend?
Recommend building,
Well, first he says to Pharaoh, you need to hire somebody who is
Smart.
smart. You got to hire somebody who's smart. And if they're truly smart, what will they do? And this is like Joseph giving his resume. Now Joseph has shifted from interpreter to a job interview. You know, he is now interviewing for a job. You know, now if it were me, I would
Build a reserve.
I would, every year of those bumper crop years, I would collect what?
A fifth.
I would collect a fifth, which is a fair amount. I'm going to collect a fifth of the crops from all over the land. And what am I going to do with it?
Store it for the
I'm
bad years.
going to store it. I'm going to build huge granaries. And I am going to store, 1/5 of everything grown in Egypt during those 7 years. Why am I going to do that?
Help with the 7 years of famine.
Because when the famine comes, now I will have
Surplus.
barns full of grain. And so the famine isn't we'll be able to deal with, we'll be able to survive the famine. And what does the king do?
Make Joseph the governor.
Okay. He decides he's going to make Joseph, but why does he decide he's going to make Joseph? He doesn't say, I'm going to make Joseph governor, but man, I like his plan. I like his plan. I like the cut of his jib.
He knew that God was.
God's spirit is with him. So again, the writer's making sure God is the one involved in it. Pharaoh sees God is, so he appoints Joseph, and what does he do as he appoints Joseph? I'm going to put you in
Charge our house.
in charge. And I am going to give you some symbols of authority. And what does he do?
Gives him a ring and a.
Gives him a signet ring. And why is a signet ring really, really significant?
He's an authority.
A signet ring is what you put into the wax. That becomes a sign of power, because it's not just any ring, it is Pharaoh's ring, the king's ring. So in other words, now Joseph can act
like a king.
like a king. Now, we look at this and we say, well, when he was with Potiphar,
He was the head of everything.
only Potiphar had to worry about lunch. When he was in jail, he was in charge of everything. Now in Egypt,
He's in charge.
he's in charge of everything again. So and why is he in charge? Because God put him in charge. Now, Now Joseph also picks up something else. What else does he pick up?
Gold chain
He picks up a gold chain, which is really kind of cool.
and a second royal chariot.
A chariot. What else does he pick up? After he gets the signet ring and the new clothes and the chain and the chariot, he gets himself a wife. And Pharaoh gives him a wife, and she is pretty important, right? She is a priestess. So she isn't Jewish. She's well heeled in Egyptian society. And again, as in a little aside, a lot of these ancient cultures, particularly agricultural cultures, have fertility. The fertility of the soil is crucial when you have an agricultural society. Absolutely crucial. So what you end up with in these agricultural societies is you tend to worship female gods. You have male gods who are often in charge of things like storms. But it's the female gods you really have to kind of suck up to, because they are the ones who make the soil fertile. And that's a big deal when you're in an agricultural society. And these cults, these religions that center around female gods, also center around priestesses. Women serve these goddesses. That's why last week when we looked at Judah and Tamar was hanging out in front of the temple, because part of religious worship was the fertility. That was part of worship. And I think I said last week, that's why men back then, you didn't have to beg them to go to church. So anyway, he marries a priestess. So somebody really viewed as important in society, and not a surprise because what Joseph is dealing with is, the fertility of the soil. This is going to be these female gods. That's going to be the struggle once the people move into the land. Because when you move into the land, you stop being herders that just move around. Herders following flocks don't have countries. They just move around. When you settle down, you start raising crops. When you start raising crops, you need a fertile soil. And so all of a sudden, there's the temptation, and the God of Israel would be the God that leads, right? The God that leads. You don't want a God that leads you when you got a farm. When you got a farm, you don't want a God that's going to lead you to green pastures or still water. You don't want a God that does that. Because you want a God that's leading you away from your farm. That's nuts. You want a God that's going to do what?
Fertile ground.
Yeah, make your farm as fertile as possible. But he wants you to stay there. That God wants you to stay there, and he's going to give you, you don't want him to lead you. And that's going to be the struggle when they settle into the land. The Jews, the children of Israel are always going to be tempted by the fertility God. Yeah, well, the fertility goddesses, that make the soil fertile. That's going to be the temptation that's going to be offered once they settle into the land. That's going to be the struggle. How the two gods, senses of gods. Okay, so, and by the way, one of the symbols of the fertility gods and goddesses particularly are the snake. It's a snake. The snake becomes one of the images that they hold up as sacred because the snake is sort of a phallic image as an animal. And so it's held as a revered creature. And that's why the fact that in Genesis 2 or Genesis 3, the snake becomes the tempter, becomes this and is cursed, ends up having that image as a curse by God that is a huge elbow at fertility religions. Man, you couldn't give a shot at fertility religions any more than what's given in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. Man, that boom, the writer is really giving it to those religions. Anyway, so Joseph is now in charge, right, of Egypt, and what ends up, he does what he's supposed to do, right? He gathers up the grain, and in fact, how does it describe the grain described?
Sand of the sea.
Like the sand of the sea. There's so much grain. In fact, there's so much grain, they stop keeping records of it. There's so much of it. Now, when this is going on, what's happening in Joseph's personal life? He has 2 sons. And now we know this story before. We've been here before, right? 2 sons. And we said that Joseph seemed to be the favorite of Israel. So good chance the promise is going to go through Joseph, right? And here we got Joseph having 2 sons. Which one is the older? Manasseh is the older and Ephraim is the younger. But like I said, we've been here before. Of the 2, who will probably carry the promise? Ephraim's probably going to carry the promise. Now understand, Ephraim's going to be a northern tribe. It's going to be the dominant, the big northern tribe. So this is a northern story. Judah's going to be the dominant tribe in the south. But Ephraim's going to be, these are northern stories. Okay, so anyway, so we've got these 2 boys, and they're going to play a role a little bit later in this account, in the continuation of the story. What happens after the years of plenty? 7 years of bumper crops. Famine hits the land, right? And what happens during the famine?
Joseph opens the storehouses and sold.
Well, it becomes really interesting because we've got this famine now, right? And nobody's growing grain. And he's collected 1/5 during the 7 years of plenty, right? He opens the storehouses, but he doesn't give the grain away. He sells the grain. And who's he selling it to?
Oh, Egyptians.
He's selling them to the Egyptians and every nation of the world. Because it's a global. The writer is talking about a global famine. So he's selling this grain. Now that becomes really interesting, because what's going to end up happening? Because remember, one of the things we saw is that God was with Joseph, right? And when God was with Joseph with Potiphar, what happened to Potiphar? When Joseph was serving Potiphar, what happened to
Oh, he
Potiphar?
had the blessing.
Yeah, he had all kinds of blessings. And we've seen that before with the other. When Jacob with Laban. Laban was blessed. So we see the one that carries the promises. He not only is he blessed, but he blesses those who are with him. We got the king of Egypt. It's really hard to say, ooh, the king of Egypt's going to be blessed, because the king of Egypt has
Lots already.
lots already. So it's really hard to show that the king is going to be blessed. That's why the selling of the grain becomes kind of important, because we're going to see next week that he's selling it to the Egyptians, right? And when the Egyptians run out of money, and they're going to run out of money as they're buying grain to survive, Joseph's going to say, I'll make you a deal. And what do you think the deal's going
Let
to
me
be?
get home.
Huh?
Let me get home.
I'm going to, I'll let you buy on credit, and you'll have to put your land up as collateral. You sign your land over to me, and I'll give you grain. And they say, hot dog, we're hungry, we'll do it. And so the land, all of a sudden, all the land becomes, well, not Joseph, it becomes Pharaoh, becomes the king. He's acting in his name. And then when they run out of grain, and all the land belongs to Pharaoh, the people say, we're still hungry. And Joseph said, well, let me make a deal with you. You don't have any more land, because that all belongs to the king. In fact, the only thing you got now is
Money.
money's gone. They don't have any money.
Family.
Ooh, the only thing you got now is yourself and your families.
Slavery.
I'll make a deal with you. You sell yourself to Pharaoh, and I'll get you grain. And so at the end of the story, Pharaoh ends up owning all the land and all the people. So Pharaoh is blessed. is blessed. Okay. And I think that's why that's happening. You've got to show that Joseph is causing blessings. And that's a hard thing to do when you talk about a king. He is really going to be, especially a king going through famine.
Yeah.
So the king is going to be blessed. He's going to end up with the story owning everything.
But wouldn't he already own everything anyway?
Well,
He could take it because he's king?
Well, he could take it, but the people become sharecroppers. And so the land belongs to him, but also the people belong. And so he's not, I think, again, it's an attempt that the writer is using to show that Pharaoh is continuing to be big. How that would practically work out, who knows? Because it doesn't say. But Pharaoh's wealth increases as a result of Joseph in this famine. Okay, that's the beginning. Now we're going to have, next week we're going to look at 42 through 45. And Joseph's, whom have we not heard of lately?
His family.
We haven't heard of his family back home, right? But this is a global famine. So his family back home is hungry.
All right.
Is hungry. So now his family is going to
Come ask for food.
re-enter the story. Is going to re-enter the story, and that's what we're going to hear about next week. And this is a story again about who? Well, whom? It's a story about God. This is a story about God. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and remind us that you are in control. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to work out the way we want it to work out. But we do believe you're in control, and we do believe you are gracious, and you work with compassion and mercy. We believe that. Therefore, in the end, we can be confident that our destinies are secure. That's the hope we have from you. So especially when times get a little bit tough. Help us to remember that this is really your story and that we will be where you have called us to be. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.